What's up? Welcome back. It's been a while since I did a video for YouTube. And in this video, I think video has been long overdue because always gotten a lot of questions, right? For years since I've been making videos, which is going back to 2009. But probably the number one question I've always got is questions dealing with African religions. For the most part, there's no question, right? That's always been a question that people have asked me over and over and over again, and I haven't. I mean, I may have done a one or two videos, maybe of African spirituality. I can only remember one off the top of my head, but I haven't really addressed it like I'm going to do now. Because when you deal with African spirituality, especially African spirituality that's been transported from Africa to the diaspora, right? Whether you're talking about the the diaspora created by the Europeans, which is basically from the slave trade, slaves getting transported to North and South and Central America and the Caribbean islands, or the diaspora created by the Africans. I'm sorry, not by the Africans. The diaspora created by the Arabs, which in the Arabian slave trade is a little bit harder to measure because that can go into the slaves being transported to Arabia, right? You know, Kuwait, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, but then it could also go as far as Asia, right? So you would even have people from the Arabian slave trade being transported to India. So you have Africans. So even today, you still have actually, if you go to certain parts of India, you would actually see people with what they call coarse hair, right? Or hair that's associated with blackness, right? You see braids, right? You see them sometimes. They'll even have, they use drums from Central Africa, and this is in India and Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Even when you go as far as Eastern Europe, the Abaquas, right, in Georgia, you see we're in village. There's a village out there, and Georgia, not Georgia in the United States, Georgia, Eastern Europe, right, which is now controlled by Russia. That part of Eastern Europe, at least, you would actually see a black village, even presently today. So the Arabian slave trade is a little bit harder to measure because I think it went to more places in a sense, and it went to places that you normally wouldn't associate with black culture. And then even once you get past the slave trade, you've had the Negritos and the Austronesian peoples, right, who were the first people to leave Africa, right? So the Austronesian people and the Negritos, you're talking about places like some parts of the Philippines, the Melanesian Islands. So you're going to go into Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Fiji Islands, places like that, right? So those were the first groups to leave Africa. So even that's why today, I mean, they left Africa so long that when they left, there wasn't even any other race, right, in Africa. So now when you do a DNA test on them, even though they may look more black, you can see that they're different because they've evolved so differently because they lived in basic Oceania for such a long time. And then not just Oceania, Southeast Asia. So you're talking about Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia. So when you deal with African traditional religions, or what some people call them ATRs, it's very hard to just give a broad definition or a general definition, not even broad, a general definition, because first off, Africa is so big. You can actually, they even said Africa is a lot bigger than they thought, right? So you can actually put Russia, Western Europe, North America, China, and India together, and Africa is still bigger. So whenever you talk about African religions, in a lot of ways, you would actually find that religions in other places, even sometimes cultures in other places, will be closer to each other than actually some African systems. Yes, there's some commonalities that every system would have for the most part in Africa, where you would see, they might talk about one power, but then have a lot of other minor powers that you go to the minor powers in the everyday life. The major power you don't really interact with as much, right? Almost every single African system would have that, right? Most African systems will talk about the ancestors and the importance of the ancestors, the importance of remembering the ancestors, maybe the importance of the fact that the ancestors are still with you. But then even that is a little different because if you go to Australia and Aborigines, for them, when someone dies, you don't mention them anymore. So even when people study ATRs, they would always say, well, they always talk about ancestors, but even that can change because you're dealing with a continent that is is so vast that in reality, you go to West and East Africa, they even said even when it comes to genetics, if you go to Europe, the population of Europe is actually closer to the DNA of the population of Asia. They're closer to the DNA of the population of Asia if you compare them to West and East Africa. So meaning West and East Africans have actually a bigger gap genetically than even some people in Europe versus some people in Asia. Why? Because Africa is so vast. So when you deal with, so if that's when it comes to genetics, sometimes you even get that when it comes to spirituality. But because most people listen to this video will be in America, will be more affected by the American, um, not even America, but the Americas, right? North, South, Central America, and Caribbean, right? Most people will be coming from that. So when you deal with those regions, the dominant spiritual systems would probably be Vodun, Palo, um, Obeah, and then in America they might have what you call Kemetic spirituality, right? So those tend to be the dominant systems. And I think it's important because even when it comes to those systems, there's a lot of things that people don't get kind of confused and don't really realize about those systems. So for instance, perfect example, when you deal with the spirituality of the Yoruba or Ifa or Lokumi, some people would even have a Santeria versus, let's say, Vodun. Yes, they're both from West Africa. They both, you can actually say the origins are from southern Nigeria, which then got transported to Benin, maybe Togo, Ghana. Then from that point, when the slave trade came in, those people brought that spirituality, those beliefs to the Americas, right? But even before the slave trade happened, there was a separation. So when you get the Dahomey, or what you call the Dahomey Empire, or the Fauna Ewe, right, which is more what Vodun is coming from, it's gonna be a little different than, let's say, Yoruba, right? Which would be more in the Latin American territories. You might get in the English-speaking Caribbean as well, but it will be fused into what they call Obeah. So traditionally, when you deal with, let's say, the beliefs of the Yoruba versus the beliefs of the Dahomey, there's gonna be similarities, but there's gonna be little differences. Like in Vodun, you might use what they call veves, which is gonna be like symbols, or these kind of symbols that you would draw, usually in cornmeal or bullet powder, or gunpowder, I should say, to, in a sense, call that energy to this plane, right? Where in Santeria and Lukumi, you may not do that as much. Now, even when it comes to, like, if you look at even Kemetic spirituality, right, which is what some people call Egyptian spirituality, or ancient Egyptian spirituality, right? But Kemet would be the name that most people would prefer. If you see it fused, like most of the time when you deal with Kemetic spirituality, it tends to be more, I don't want to say philosophy, but the Kemetic spirituality most people deal with, it's more philosophy in terms of it deals with more mental, right? So it's kind of like an enhanced version of Kabbalah, right? So they'll have a tree of life, instead of 10 sephers, they might have 11, right? But for the most part, it tends to be more philosophy, and it's a psychology. Now, philosophy is actually a bad word, psychology. And I actually agree with that to some extent, because psychology, before you could really do enhanced spirituality or advanced spirituality, your mind needs to be right. So you have to be coming from a psychological standpoint in the beginning, right? But if you notice, if they do what some people call magic, meaning practitioners of Kemetic spirituality, if they do magic, it's usually going to be fused with Yoruba. So some people say, why Yoruba, not Vodun? Well, basically because if you look at even in the past, the Yoruba tribe had a better relationship with outsiders, or with mixing other cultures with their spirituality, than, let's say, Fauna and Ewe, right, or the Dahomey. So if you go into now, good example, Haiti, right, which is going to be more coming from that Dahomey lineage, you wouldn't see them mixed that as much with, like, let's say, Hinduism or even Gnosticism. They'll mix it Catholicism. I do admit you will see Catholicism mixed with Voodoo in Haiti, but you wouldn't see it mixed as much. So sometimes some practitioners of Voodoo would say, oh, some people use African religions and they're using Eastern spirituality, they're using Western spirituality, but in Voodoo you don't do that as much. Why? Because if you go into that West African empire or culture that first manifested, Fauna or what the forerunners of Voodoo were, they were the more purists, right? So they're not going to mix their stuff up with other people as much. But let's say in Yoruba, if you're going to mix it, they would mix it more. Now, don't get me wrong, that mixing a lot of times is still an American thing, or when I say America, Americas, right? Meaning you still seen that more once the slaves came over to this part of the world. Why? Because in this part of the world, the slaves are mixing each other, meaning in Africa, you could say, well, I'm Igbo, right? I'm Yoruba, I'm Fauna, I'm Ewe. But and you could kind of mix with each other. But when they were all put in the same space, all of a sudden they start mixing with each other. So West Africans start mixing with Central Africans. So a lot of times, even when it comes to Central Africa, a lot of people in the Americas are actually descendants of Central Africans. And you know that because even if you went to Latin American territories and the Afro-Latin religions, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Brazil, no question, right? That's Ifa territory or that's Yoruba territory, right? Even though Brazil, they have a lot of Central African elements too. In fact, they probably actually more. They actually have more Central African blood than they have West African blood. But when it comes to the spiritual practice, West Africa tends to be more dominant. But if you look at any other part of Latin America outside Brazil, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, right, Peru, Ecuador, and I'm talking about the Afro-Latin regions of Ecuador and Peru, Bolivia, it's not even close. Central Africa dominates. Palo dominates. And it's so crazy because even when you get outside of the spiritual aspect, even in Puerto Rico and Cuba, if you look at the music, it's no question more Central African. But what happened is the Central African tribes came first to this part of the world when they're in the slave trade. The Yoruba were the last people to really come in large numbers. So when the Central Africans came, or even when you had Africans from Senegambia, which you're talking about Guinea, Senegal, that region, Ivory Coast, when they came here first, their cultures and to some extent their spirituality was erased. So when the Yoruba came here, by the time Yoruba came here, the colonial masters were not as aggressive anymore with erasing culture. So once the Yoruba came, then even if you were from Central Africa or from Senegambia, which is a different part, which is more west, right? Because Nigeria is West Africa, but it's more West Central Africa. We talk about the African coast, right? Even if you're from those regions, your culture was already erased. So when the Yoruba came with their culture, you just absorbed it, right? So in a lot of ways, the ATRs in the Americas would be much different than even their counterparts in Africa, where, for instance, in Haiti, you see in Vodun, they would have it where you may not see outside African influence, right? So you're not going to see Indian and Islamic influence as much in Haitian Vodun, but you would see where in Haitian Vodun, they would have even, like, for instance, they would actually fuse Yoruba spirits with their practice, right? So in Haiti, they might say Nagos, which you're talking about Yoruba spirits, right? So you would see Dahomey, Yoruba, and you'd even see Congo in Haitian Vodun. But if you go to Benin, you're not going to see that. In Benin, you're going to see more pure Benin voodoo or Dahomey voodoo. And that is actually something that's common, and it's not really saying that that's why I'm not even saying that Haitian voodoo is inferior to Benin voodoo. I'm just telling you how they will change once they came to this part of the world. But at the same time, you would have it where someone who's practicing Haitian voodoo may say, well, we don't take non-white spirituality infused with our systems, right? But then, let's say if you go to a place like Trinidad, good example, you would have it where you have either Shango Baptist or Spiritual Baptist and Obeah, right? What they call Spiritual Baptist or Shango Baptist is kind of like a version of Yoruba. But it's a version in the sense that you would still probably see it. You could see some lineages mixed with India, because why? There's a lot of Indians in Trinidad, East Indians, right? So you would see sometimes Yoruba practices mixed with East Indian practices, sometimes even mixed with Sufi practices or Muslim practices, because you have a lot of Muslims in Trinidad too. So, and that's from the Shango Baptist or Spiritual Baptist part. If you're doing Obeah is a lot different in the sense that Obeah can be fused in any system, right? So if you look at a place like Trinidad, and their version of Ifa or spiritual or Yoruba spirituality is mixed with other non-African cultures, then you look at Obeah definitely can be mixed with non-African cultures, right? So then when a person, let's say from Haiti or who's practicing Haitian voodoo would say, oh, well, we don't mix it with non-African systems, someone coming from Trinidad would. Is one right, is one wrong? No. The fact that the only thing wrong about either standpoint is that they may not be able to do the research and see that, oh, the way you're practicing is based on how slavery was in your region, as well as maybe other cultures around from your region. And additionally, as you could even add, depends on what part of Africa your slaves are coming from. Because, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the English, believe it or not, all tribes weren't the same to them. There were some tribes, each one of those four favored over others. Then if you get a place like Trinidad, it's even worse because the Spanish, the French, the British all had Trinidad. So you're gonna have a population that's gonna be a little bit more mixed in terms of the African version than even other colonies. So when you're dealing with ATRs, I guess rather than say which one is better, right, or even worse, say they all the same, because that actually does happen too, especially in America, where because a lot of practitioners in America, I don't like to use the word philosophy, but it's coming from more of a psychological angle. They may underestimate how all those systems, yes, there's going to be like some archetypes of what some people call gods, even though in Africa they didn't really look at it as gods per se. They looked at it as minor forces, major forces. Those really one god and different minor forces. But even when you describe those minor forces, right, it's going to be a little different. So yeah, I could say Izwilu and let's say Oshun is the same goddess, but anyone who actually practices those systems magically would say, hell no, they're not the same. But when you're coming from the psychological standpoint, you would say, oh yeah, they're the same. There's two different expressions. And I think that's important because the key difference with real ATR or real African spirituality versus psychology is the fact that if you're practicing psychology and something to make yourself feel better, something to enhance, let's say, your awareness of your racial identity, that's different than when you begin practicing the magic itself. That's two different ball games. And when you practice the magic itself, you're doing energy. And yeah, some energy is not as compatible with other energy. And if you mix them, you get some really bad results. That's why sometimes traditional African religions get a bad rep, because when some people practice them, they get sometimes bad results that come from it because they don't really know what they're doing. These things are not something that you're supposed to start to do before you really know what you're doing. And unfortunately, when I get a lot of questions on African religions, right, you're talking about questions dealing with, this person, let's say, does blood sacrifice? Is blood sacrifice right? Is it wrong? And blood sacrifice, I'm talking about, when I say blood sacrifice, I'm meaning using animals, right? Not human, obviously, but animals. And I would say this. Obviously, in African traditional religions, animal sacrifice is something that's part of it. And some systems do it, some systems don't. And I think that's what people have to realize. It's not really about right or wrong. So it depends on the system that you're talking about. But the key thing that I think people should understand, especially in the Americas, is that true African spirituality is living, it's breathing, it's evolving, right? So even when you go into the fact, like when you talk about, because I always like to talk about the esoteric versions of Christianity, the esoteric versions of Islam, Sufism, the esoteric version of Judaism, which is Kabbalah. All three of those systems actually have ties in Africa as well, because what will naturally happen is, as much as people talk, even when you deal with something like Kabbalah is a system that works perfectly if you think about it for what it is, right? You're dealing with psychology. You're dealing with basically transforming your consciousness from lead to gold. When the practitioners of Kabbalah in Africa, when they would deal with each other, you'll realize, listen, if somebody's from the south, from the east, from the west, they're coming from a different region, right? They're going to be dealing with, the energies they're dealing with could be different. But when you have a unifying system like, let's say, Kabbalah, and again, it's going to be a little bit different than traditional Jewish Kabbalah, right? There's going to be similarities, but there's going to be little differences. Kabbalah being more of a solar system or sun-based system would be like a unifier in a sense. So that's why even in Africa today, sometimes you have little pockets where you see some Yoruba, some people who live in Nigeria who might practice a version of Judaism or Kabbalah, Ghana, the Igbo, for instance. The Igbo, they always have talk about their ties to the East. And that's what they're talking about. I mean, they may not realize it, but that's where that's coming from. It was kind of like when you deal with Judaism, or really the Kabbalah version of Judaism, you're talking about the tree of life. You're talking about a more universal system that if you're coming from two different regions, you could actually have that in common. Because that's the difference. Because some people may say, but why do you need that to have it in common? Well, think of it. For instance, the oldest African tribe, the Bush people, or the San peoples of South Africa, right? Their type of spirituality, they deal more with the desert. They deal more with being able to invoke certain spirits that are related to the desert, that are related to non-plant intelligences. Because if you look at almost every African system, for the most part, you're talking about what? They depend a lot on herbs. The animal sacrifice gets the hype, but if you look at it in reality, it's herbs, right? Herbs is a huge thing in ATRs, right? When you deal with the Sand people, yeah, they could use herbs. Obviously, they do, but they also specialize in being able to invoke spirits that come from regions that don't have as much plant life. And then if you look, which makes them traditionally good healers. So if you look at even Sangoma, right? The Sangoma people or the Sangoma system would come about when one. The Bantu tribes of Central Africa will go down to the south and mix with the indigenous South Africans, and then you get Sangoma, right? And in the Sangoma system, you're talking about a system that is really good for healing, right? So when you're looking at all these different systems, they're all going to evolve differently. That's what people don't have to realize, especially with their counterparts in the Americas. And I've done this video and I haven't even hit, right, how it evolved with the Tamati societies and the Quat societies in Melanesia, or even high up in Pacific Islands and in like more Polynesia, Micronesia. So when you deal with ATRs, first thing, the main thing you really have to understand is, and why African traditional religions is kind of hard to understand, is because in the Western world currently, the Western world bullies you into dropping those systems. And what I mean by that is, because the Western system is so sophisticated, it can bully you without you even knowing you're being bullied. Right? So you have the obvious bullying, right? Where you say, okay, if you talk about Vodun or anything like that, you're going to get people who say you're a pagan. You're going to get people who say you're worshiping the devil, right? So you obviously have the more material versions of Gnosticism, Sufism, and Kabbalah, which is talking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In those versions, they obviously just try to get you to drop those African systems, right? And when you drop the African systems, you're probably going to drop the culture. You're probably going to drop even the language, right? So it's not just, it starts off with spirituality, but then it goes into other facets. And before you know it, 200-300 years go by, you forget who you are. That's obvious. But then you have the more subtle versions of those systems as well. Meaning of the, you could call it the global system that gets you, because you have to understand, this whole global system is built on the energy of slave trade, right? So because of that, it can't really, you can't have, like, for it to exist, the ATRs have to be diminished. And I'm not going to even try to say that the African systems as we know now are perfect. They're not, because now most of the time it's more religious. Even when I'm saying ATR, I'm saying African traditional religions. It's not, you're not even supposed to say religion. It's supposed to be a lifestyle, right? It's supposed to be something that affects you, what you listen to musically, the way you talk, your language. That you might be able to talk a Western language, but then you could talk your traditional language as well, right? It's not just spirituality, and I think that's where people get it confused. But what ends up happening is that because this system is built on top of it, it has to bully it. It can't really extinguish it because it's too strong in the inner worlds. Honestly, it's too strong, right? You can't kill it completely, but you can suppress it. So what happens is the system acts like a bully. So all of a sudden, I would feel self-conscious mentioning Vodun and Sangoma or Obeah, which is really what I practice, right? I would feel self-conscious mentioning that, and then they'll force you to mention, let's say, the three mainstream religions. And then the bullying is so sophisticated, even if you're smart enough to say, well, the three mainstream religions suppress my cultures, it got something for you too. So then they would say, well, I'm practicing a Kemetic-based spiritual system, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but people forget, even when people talk about Egypt being the origin of African spiritual systems, that's actually crazy. Why? Because the oldest Africans were the indigenous Africans of South Africa, the indigenous Africans of East Africa, right? And the Pygmies, right? Like when you look at, or the bakas, and which are the short people that some people call Pygmies, right? Which visually look like the Negritos in Asia, even though they're a little different genetically. So when you're dealing with the Pygmy spirituality, you're dealing with the San spirituality, they're far older than Kemet. In fact, the Kemites used to call the Pygmies the ancient ones. But yet, people practicing Kemetic spirituality will barely even know that. So they will say Egypt is the oldest African spiritual system, and it's not even close. Egypt might be the oldest system that's written down. But here's the difference. ATRs, African traditional religions, were considered so advanced that there was too much information to writing books. So even when you're getting Egypt or Kemet, you're talking about the meeting place of all African spiritual systems. So you're talking about the fact that when the North, when the East, when the West, when the Central gets together, they said, oh, and they write it down. Kemet was kind of like the place where you can actually, you wrote it all down, and then when you look at the hieroglyphics, when you look at their records, it's the oldest from that standpoint. But remember, in African traditional religions or spirituality, you knew that if you really wrote stuff down, when you write something down, it's never as, the knowledge that's written down is never going to be as advanced as knowledge that's orally passed. That's the difference. So you basically have cave drawings where the San or the bush people of, the Bushmen of Southern Africa had some drawings from 50,000 years ago. They had drawings before that's older than the pyramids. So again, what happens? The system, right, let's say in America, knows that some people are going to be naturally drawn to this type of stuff, so it adapts and it says, well, okay, I'm gonna give you Kemet or Egypt, and then what I'm gonna do, you're gonna be, you might be able to get the psychological part of it, but you're never gonna be able to get the energetic part of it, and that's what happens. And that's no disrespect to people who practice Egyptian spirituality. I'm just telling you basically how the system works. It can adapt, and it's not going to always be obvious with Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. No, it's going to be, okay, you're practicing Kemetic spirituality. You're practicing, you're a Hebrew Israelite, right? So if you're a Hebrew Israelite, what do you say? Well, I don't like Africans because they started the slave trade. That's what a traditional Hebrew Israelite would say. And what happens? You're cutting yourself off energetically from your starting point. And again, that's no disrespect to Hebrew Israelites. You just have to be aware of how the system can adapt and modify itself. And in the end of the day, it's only doing that to bully you into not practicing those systems. Now, I'm not making this video to get people to run to ATRs, African traditional religions, because I do say, and I think this is what's related to a lot of questions I get. When you come to me with abuses that some people who are practicing these systems are doing, remember, even these systems now are sort of the same problem that's happened with Kemetic spirituality. It's kind of happened to these systems. We're saying African traditional religions. We're saying basically religion, right? You're talking about a lifestyle that's been transported to the Americas, but because it's not an active chain or the connection has been broken, it's turned into religion where before it was supposed to be a lifestyle. So that's actually why out of, when you deal with Palo, when you deal with Yoruba-based spirituality, right? When you talk about Candabole, Santeria, Lukumi, regular de la Ocha, when you deal with all these things, remember this. Even like when you look at a system like Obeah, the reason why Obeah was known to be the most mysterious system, they call Obeah the science, because Obeah is not something that you're really going to be able to just type up online, look and get information on. Even if you get information about Obeah online, 9 out of 10 things you're going to see is the version of Obeah that's mixed with Orisha worship. So you're just basically talking about an enhanced version of Yoruba spirituality, where real Obeah, if you're talking about what the lineage coming from Ghana or the Akans, or you're talking about the Igbo in Nigeria, real Obeah is something much more mysterious because it's sort of like, you see people always kind of fuse it with Kabbalah because it's kind of a combination of both, where when they call it the science, it's because a lot of times you're more scientific. A lot of times you are working with Kabbalah, your consciousness is supposed to be transformed, and then you plug into that energy. And I think that's what people miss. When they look at me and say, why do you always point people to Kabbalah? Why do you always point people to more Hermeticism? Is because don't hear this video and think I'm dissing psychology. You have to basically get your mind right and look at yoga. That's what yoga was. Yoga is a psychological based system that helps you connect to the divine. You have to do that first before you start calling on certain energies. So when you see a lot of craziness going on in those systems, right, that's why a lot of my emails tend to be about. You're going to see those craziness because you have to transform before you start to actually invoke those energies. So when you take that into account, that's why I don't really have a beef with the people who practice Kemetic spirituality, because they actually have a point. The only difference is that they sometimes forget that the type of spiritual system they've been practicing has still been recreated from various sources, right? So that's why if they have to start to invoke certain energies, they would combine it with Yoruba, right? And they don't really realize, it's not saying they shouldn't do that, but then that's why then when you get into Vodun, sometimes they might clash with Vodun practitioners, because what people don't really realize is when you're dealing with African spirituality in itself, it's very intertwined with culture. It's very intertwined with language. It's very intertwined with music, with food. So they can't really separate the two. So if you're practicing it because you feel beat up and, you know, you don't like so-called white supremacy, it's still not going to work for you the same. Because it's then what you're doing is you're practicing a reactive-based system. And if you're practicing a reactive-based system, it's going to most likely be religion. And if it's religion, it's only going to be marginally better than Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. What it has to be is a lifestyle. And if it's not a lifestyle, it's not going to work for you as much. So in this links, if you look at the summary, I have a lot of books and of basically different African traditional religions, right? Even some things like, certain types of Christianity that was in Central Africa, right? So when you hear names like Simon Togo and you hear the stuff that he can do, that's a name that people should know more of, because people don't know about him. And he was actually a person from Central Africa practicing Christianity. He wasn't really, at least publicly, a practitioner of ATRs. And he was still able to do things that most people who are practicing ATRs can't do. So even when you're critiquing Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, always remember, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism become more harmful if you're into the African mindset, if you don't plug it in with African traditional religions. Because in the end of the day, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism actually still have ties in Africa. Even when you talk about Gnosticism, there's a version of African Gnosticism that, makes the European version look like a joke. And that's not no disrespect to the Europeans. I'm just saying that whenever you're depending on writing things down, it's never going to be as sophisticated as the things that's orally passed. Unfortunately, the things that's orally passed is harder to put it on the internet. So that's why it's sad to see it, but in the West, we have to actually go backwards, where we actually have to read the books. We actually have to look at the written material, get our minds right, and then when we get our minds right, we're able to then see or differentiate facts from fiction, or even things from being able to separate religion from lifestyle. If the spiritual system is more of a religion, it's going to have more flaws. And unfortunately, 9 out of 10 ATRs or African religions in the Americas is going to be more religion than lifestyle. So if that's the case, you should always be cautious. So when I push Hermeticism, Tarot, or Tree of Life and Kabbalah, it's because your mind has to be right so you can differentiate what's right and what's wrong with these various systems. So I hope this helps. Till next time, peace.